It is 30 degrees outside right now, and this car's been sitting for a while. It'll be fun to start it up and see how she starts in cold weather. I have never started this car in the winter. Let's see what happens.
Video and talk about. And now that I started it, I've got to get it up to operating temperature. I don't want to shut it down, you know. So for vehicle number 6, we're going to talk about a car that I kind of wish I kept longer. It was a 1999 Nissan Sentra GXE limited edition. We're going to talk about that car next, so stay tuned. Look at the AC turns on 30-degree weather. That's going to be a solid no. What if I put it in defrost? No, it's too cold. It's not going to kick in. I'm going to turn the heat up. Oh yeah. There we go. I'll let the car warm up. I'll leave the garage door open for the meantime.
It's one of the smoothest running engines I've ever come across. It's 25 years old and so smooth. So buttery smooth. But I figure we'll start it up and let it warm up a little bit, and then we'll shoot our video. It's always good when you have a car sitting in the garage over winter. It's not a bad idea to start it up every once in a while to keep the oil flowing, keep things coated, and you know, not a bad idea. I didn't fog this engine when I put it away, so that's why I'm doing this. You don't have to fog an engine, but it's not a bad idea. Alright, so for this segment, we're going to talk about vehicle number 6. So I reached a point in my life where I needed a vehicle that was reliable and fuel efficient. My Pathfinder was none of those things. I loved driving around that old, 4x4, and it was a fun vehicle to drive. It just didn't have the reliability and fuel efficiency that I needed, amongst other things. It was constantly breaking down. And anyway, so fuel prices were starting to go pretty nuts. It was 2004, and if I recall, because of the Middle East conflict and all that, we were looking at around $4 a gallon gas. At least, actually $3 a gallon gas. $4 a gallon gas was coming, but we didn't know it. So I decided that what I was really in the market for was a small sedan, a compact sedan or a subcompact. And because of my affinity for Nissans, I decided to stick with the Nissan family, which narrows it down to the Nissan Sentra. The Versa was a few years out, and the Sentra had just been redesigned for 2000. And well, actually, it was a 4-year-old design by this point. So, given my price range, I was really kind of limited to something made you know, in between 1995 and 1999 or so. I didn't want to spend more than $7,000. And I knew I was financing it, so it had to be something newer, as new as possible. So I looked online. I went to my the website of my local Nissan dealer, and right there in full color was an ad for a 1999 Sentra GXE limited edition in one of my favorite colors, burgundy. It had 75,000 miles, and they were asking, if I recall, it was something around, I think on the website, what they would do is they'd fudge the prices. You know, it was like market value, $8,000, selling for 7 or 75, you know, discount this, discount here, and that's how they try to make it look like the best bargain you'll ever find. I looked up the book value of the car with that mileage and those features, and it landed somewhere in their ballpark. So I'm like, well, I'm gonna look it up. I'm gonna go look at it. So I, at the time, I had one running and driving vehicle. It was a 1970 Pontiac Tempest. It had very poor brake power. It was running on 5 out of 6 cylinders, and I didn't really want to put any money into it yet. I didn't really know what I was going to do with that car. So I called up a friend who was more than happy to drive me down to the dealership and to look at the car. So I told him, you know, there's a really good chance I'm going to leave with this car, so, you know, just hang tight, just in case things don't work out. So I found a salesman, rather he found me, and we saw the car. I got the keys. We took it for a test drive, and really the car was everything I wanted, and then some. It was, you know, it wasn't a stripper model. It was it had the optional. It had all the options really for the Sentra for that year, including the limited edition options, like the remote keyless entry was a limited edition feature, and there was one other thing that it had. I forget what. But it was a burgundy Sentra, the facelifted generation, where the grille, it was almost like a flat grille. Like it didn't really have a vented grille. It was really just, it was a smoother style. Looked similar to the later Saturn SL models. So it had the optional AM/FM cassette deck. It had the power windows, power locks, power mirrors. Air conditioning, alloy wheels, and they were they looked like hubcaps. They weren't a really beautiful design. They were very, very chintzy looking wheels, but it had them, alloys, yay. And most importantly though, it had an automatic transmission. It was like a 4-speed Jatco, you know, the cheapest one they made. And it had what I was in for it, or what I was looking for. It had the 1.6 liter motor rather than the 2 liter engine that the SE had. The Sentra SE had the 2 liter. So it was basic transportation, but it was well cared for. The car was clean. Definitely wasn't a smoker's car. You know, it didn't have a lot of scratches or dents. Now, I bought the car in the rain. It was a rainy, cold fall day. And one of the things that you'll hear a lot from experienced car buyers is don't buy a car in the rain and don't buy a car at night. And the reason for that is there were paint blemishes that I didn't see until after the car had dried. Looked beautiful in the rain. You know, I knew better, but I just really didn't care, I guess. I just needed a car, and this was a car. You know, the Nissan Sentra, I bought it because I needed a car. And it was one. Anyway. So, it had a tachometer, too. So the base model Sentra didn't have a tachometer, but this one did. It was pretty well equipped for a little hatchback, a little subcompact car, you know. Plenty of trunk space. It was comfortable-ish. And I liked the interior. It was a cloth interior that had like, you know, a pattern woven into it. That was something that almost every European or Asian car had back in the day, in the 90s. A lot of them had, it was like a crushed velour bolstering with a weaved pattern in the seat backs and in the interior trim cloth. It was nice looking. You don't really see that anymore. Although it's starting to come back on some. I noticed that Hyundai is starting to put houndstooth cloth in some of their cars, which actually looks quite nice. But anyway, all that aside, it was exactly the vehicle I needed at that time in my life, and it was a car that I wish I kept longer. You know, put more miles on it, got more of my money's worth out of it. But you know, I was young and stupid, and I didn't tend to keep things very long back then. So this car, I drove it off the lot that day. The financing went through fine. My credit was all aces, so I had no issues getting that. But some of my cockiness from when I was younger was evident here, and I'll explain that. So I wanted the most value for my money as I could possibly get. And I didn't really learn the art of walking away at that point. But in hindsight, I think I did fine, for the most part. So the price was here, and I wanted to pay somewhere down here. I wanted to pay somewhere close to $5,500 to $6,000, as close as I could get to that. I had no trade-ins, and I had no money down. No, I actually did put money down. I put $1,000 down. And the salesman, you know, said, we're not going to go that low on this, you know, but we kept negotiating. I ended up at the end of the day, and this is, again, I didn't do my research. I was just shooting from the hip, which is never good, especially when you're buying a used car or if you're running a country. Never shoot from the hip, because you're always going to get the raw end of the deal, or you're going to make a mistake, and that's exactly what I did. Or make yourself look stupid. So what I did was, I said, okay, I'll give you $65 if you replace the timing belt, water pump, and you know, do a few other maintenance related things for a car that would have 75,000 miles on it. And the guy said, okay, let me talk to my manager. And he did. He came back and he said, he had his hand out. I'm like, what? It's like, shake my hand, you bought a car, congratulations, woo! You know, the big fanfare when they make a sale. And I said, oh, great, so you're going to do this, this, and this, and no problem. So I got the car for $65. Now, this was back when you could buy a car that didn't really need anything for that kind of money, under 100,000 miles. You can't do that anymore. You know, the cars that you get right now for under $7-8 grand, even anything under 10 is kind of it's a seller's market. It really is a seller's market, because there's just not a lot out right now for that kind of money, and it's getting worse and worse every year. For the most part, incomes aren't rising. The cost of living has gone up compared to 15 years ago, and cars are getting more and more expensive and more complicated and harder to fix and more expensive to service when they can be serviced. It's a sad thing that's happening to the world right now, and I guess the same thing can be said for back then, you know, compared to years prior. But you know, not to travel too far from the subject, but buying a 6-year-old car in let's say like 1990, for example, you know, those cars built throughout the 1980s are often very unreliable, and you know, so you could buy a reliable car in the early 2000s, you know, for pretty low figures, and that's because most of the car, like at least the Japanese imports of that time, were built like tanks, and they were just bulletproof. You can't really say that anymore. But I mean, you know, like for example, a Nissan Sentra of this current time period, buying a 6-year-old Nissan Sentra would be a terrible investment because they just aren't built well. And it's funny, I just got a comment on my Nissan Pathfinder video about Nissan products and how well built they were. And I can't tell you how impressed I was with that little Sentra because it was built really well. It was solid, and it never, I think I owned it 6 months. In the 6 months I had that car, it never had a problem. I put, 10,000 miles on it. I did replace a few things on that car. For example, I believe I did a valve cover gasket because it was seeping a little bit. I did the serpentine belts, just regular maintenance item on that one. But I did serpentine belts, and I did a belt tensioner because I had an issue where I could not get the belt to, I got it to a point where it wouldn't squeak anymore, but I could hear bearing noise from the tensioner, so I had to replace it. But beyond that, I had no trouble with that car. So getting back to that raw deal I made. Now, I actually did make out pretty well because the car was worth every penny of what I paid and then some. But what I didn't realize when I made the deal and shook his hand is that the maintenance items that I said I wanted done did not apply to that vehicle. It does not have a timing belt. It was a timing chain engine. And and the water pump was something you would do when you did the timing chain. It was like a 120,000 mile pump or something like that. Or whatever. It may not have been a water pump. It was probably something else. But in other words, I basically they agreed to do maintenance that they were never going to do because it wasn't required. It wasn't part of it. You're not going to do a timing chain on an engine with 75,000 miles on it unless it needs it, and it doesn't need it. So, after realizing that and signing the papers, believe it or not, I have to give the dealer credit for this because they could have just said, well, this is what we signed, this is what you agreed to. But I looked at the exhaust system on the car, and it had some very light surface rust. And I was kind of, my pride was hurt because it was my fault. I didn't do my homework. And I looked like an idiot. And I'm like, well, you owe me something. And I said, replace the exhaust. And they did. They replaced the entire exhaust system, front to back, from the catalytic converter back, with factory Nissan parts. And they even said, it's a shame to do this because it doesn't need an exhaust. And I knew it didn't. I just wanted them to do something expensive because I felt like I was owed it. I felt entitled to that. I wasn't legally. But they said, if you want, you can have the old exhaust back. We'll put it in the trunk in pieces. I'm like, no, you can scrap it. I was just like beside myself. I actually got the dealership to replace an exhaust with completely unnecessarily. It just didn't need it. And I could have gotten 5 years out of that exhaust that I had. And I've changed my ways as I've grown and gotten more mature. But I did. I drove that car for about 6 months. I got rid of it in May of 2005. But yeah, it was a good car. I mean, Nissan Sentras today are laughed at. I mean, nobody buys Sentra. I mean, I don't know anybody who's owned a Sentra, at least not a modern one. But they really were, prior to Carlos Ghosn taking over Nissan and merging with Renault, prior to that, Nissan vehicles were built very, very well, for the most part. They had some duds here and there. But they were on so there's a lot of controversy over the Renault takeover, the Carlos Ghosn era. I mean, aside from what's going on right now with Nissan. I actually there was a book that was written about the entire merger. I used to read a lot of automotive books, and they've actually, and through that research, I've made purchasing decisions based on what I've learned. For example, I will never, ever buy a Chrysler, Fiat, Mercedes-Benz. I will never touch any of those brands for any amount of money. You could give me one and I would sell it. they're just they are garbage, and there's reasons for it. Mostly due to greedy capitalists. Cerberus capital was the main reason why they were turning into garbage, but Mercedes-Benz didn't help either. We're not talking about Chrysler, though. We're talking about Nissan. So Nissan was, in the mid to late 90s, they were hemorrhaging cash. They were just not profitable, and they were headed towards bankruptcy. And the reason for that is their suppliers, Japanese automakers, have like vertical parts networks called keiretsus. And of course I'm vaguely remembering half of what I read here, but Nissan's keiretsu was complicated. Their parts network was diverse and just overly complex. The bill of materials for their vehicles consisted of parts from a plethora of Japanese companies, and it was hard to manage. Costs were going out of control, and it was just very disorganized. That's one way to put it. Carlos Ghosn, as part of his cost-cutting measures, which is why he earned the name Le Cost Cutter, because of the Renault connection, French, Le Cost Cutter, is that he wanted to narrow down the number of suppliers to the minimum amount, and that meant completely dismantling their Japanese keiretsu, and trying to source more parts from the same suppliers, and that's what he did. And he also cut down the engineering costs. The build quality took a nosedive. He really did he gutted the soul of what made Nissan. However, what he did was save the company from the brink of collapse. So if it wasn't for Carlos Ghosn, Nissan would be a division of Ford or something right now. And I think at one point they were talking about a merger with Ford at one point. And that was, and one of the projects they worked on was the Mercury Village or Nissan Quest, which shared, it was a Ford chassis with a Nissan drivetrain, minivan. My parents had one. It was great. I loved it. But I think they were looking at merging with other automakers anyway, and Carlos Ghosn came along and made that happen. But nevertheless, it's not like Carlos Ghosn took a green and healthy company and drove it into the ground. He took a company that was failing and kept it afloat. And I think a lot of people need to realize that. They've taken a sharp direction for the worst. Propping up most of their profits with fleet vehicles did not help. I mean, if you've ever rented a car, chances are it was a Nissan Altima, So, the brand dilution certainly hurt them. But there would be no brand to dilute had he not come by. But this Sentra, though, it was a well-built product. It felt every bit Japanese as I would expect it to. Not the best in its class, but certainly not. I think the Chevy Cavalier was the worst vehicle in that class at the time, and the Sentra was just a great car. Very underpowered. It was a 1.6 with a 4-speed automatic. Now let me tell you about that transmission. So Japanese Nissan Jatco transmissions are not known for smooth, precise shifting, especially the old hydraulic ones, the old hydraulically controlled ones. Now, I don't know if the Nissan Sentra's transmission was primarily hydraulically controlled, but it certainly felt every bit it, because it was very harsh. I drove the car for 10,000, 15,000 miles or so, and the transmission was always harsh, especially first to second, and downshifting second to first. It was just abrupt, and the car would shudder. But it was worse than it should have been. And shortly after buying the car, I remembered something my father had taught me about automatic transmissions, how some of them use what's called a kickdown cable that connects from the throttle in this case, I was going to say carburetor, but on the throttle body, there's a cable that runs into the transmission, and when you step on the gas pedal, it causes the transmission to shift down, depending on how quickly and how far the pedal is pushed and how far the car is moving. And it's all controlled, in this case, I believe, electronically, but with also a lot of mechanical and hydraulic systems. So I thought maybe the cable might be frozen, like it was in my family's Honda Civic that we had back in the 90s. So what I did was I popped the hood with a flashlight. I'm looking around the throttle body, and I found that indeed the cable was off its track. It wasn't frozen, but the cable was out of its guide. So it wasn't downshifting at the right time. So I put it back on and verified that it was moving nice and freely, and it was. And it drove smoother, but it wasn't quite perfect. It was just still very harsh. And that was a characteristic of those transmissions. A friend of mine actually had, and this is fairly recent, like within the past maybe 5 years or so, I had a friend who had a 99 Sentra with 300,000 miles on it. And he only got rid of it because I think it had completely rotted out. And that was the reason why these cars developed fairly bad reputation in New England. Because we use a lot of salt on the roads, you won't find a Nissan Sentra from that. You won't find any Nissan product from that time period still on the road. If you do, it's a rarity because they would rust very badly. Nissan used a steel that wasn't well protected, and they would just rust out. The Nissan Sentras from the 95 to 99 period, I believe those are the B13s, they were known to rust in the engine cradle, the B-pillar, base of the B-pillar, where it connects to the floor, or to the rocker panels, and they would rust out in the rear shock towers, or the wheel wells. That's where they would rust, and mine had no rust at all. It was still fairly new. It was only 5 or 6 years old, so it didn't really have a chance to rust yet. I know another person that had I think it was a 98 Sentra, and her engine fell out. The engine cradle rotted out completely. So it didn't completely fall out of the car, but the motor mount broke off, and it was a whole big thing. That's what killed them. The engines that they used, the 1.6 liter engines, were bulletproof. The transmissions, they shifted like crap, but they were bulletproof. The electronics were so simple that you never really had problems with those models. Now they were building the Sentra for the United States. They were built in 2 places. We were getting them from Smyrna, Tennessee, and we were getting them from Mexico. Now mine was a Tennessee-built model, so from what I've been reading, the Mexican-built ones were having more problems than the Tennessee ones. And I believe the engines actually came from Japan. The engine and transmission were Japanese, and basically the body and the assembly took place in either Mexico or Tennessee. But I do miss that car for its complete and utter simplicity. As a matter of fact, it was that car that got me back into, like, thinking back when I got rid of my Nissan Murano and bought a Hyundai Elantra sedan. I was thinking back to that Sentra because I wanted. It's like sometimes you have to go back to the basics to really appreciate having a car that runs and drives, depending on where you are in life, financially and socially. Sometimes it's good to just go back to the basics. And that car was certainly, it was like comfort food because it was just a basic car. You put gas in it, it got 34 miles per gallon reliably, and it was reliable. And sometimes you have to go back to that to really appreciate the wonder that is the automobile. It's okay to have something fancy and fun every once in a while. But when that doesn't work out anymore for you, and it gets expensive and time-consuming to deal with all the problems, going back to something basic is always nice. Or you can just buy a Lexus and have your cake and eat it too. which is what I probably should have done at some point, but I never did. I got rid of the Sentra because I wanted a pickup truck again. Because I didn't... it's like I felt this need to have a pickup truck. And we're going to talk about that truck next. And that'll be number 8. So yeah, we're moving down that list. We're almost halfway down. Not that I don't love sitting in my freezing garage, sitting in this convertible for some reason, because I felt it would be a nice backdrop for this video series, but it's getting cold, guys. It's like 27 degrees right now, Fahrenheit. Well, until then, thank you for watching.